By the time dessert was served at the Veterans Day banquet, my father-in-law had already repeated the same speech 3 different times. According to Harold Bennett, every meaningful quality in life eventually came back to discipline, sacrifice, and leadership. After enough bourbon, those words always blended together into the same performance. The dinner had been his idea from the beginning. He invited business associates, former military officers from his civic club, neighbors from his country club community, and even a local prosecutor he insisted on introducing by title every chance he got. I spent most of the evening doing what I usually did around Harold, staying quiet, carrying dishes when servers got overwhelmed, and avoiding becoming the center of attention. That arrangement worked perfectly for him because Harold liked rooms where people could be evaluated quickly. He judged men by careers, houses, shoes, handshakes, and especially watches. Halfway through dinner, he noticed mine when I reached across the table for the rolls. He laughed softly and asked if I was still wearing that old thing. A few guests glanced automatically at my wrist. The watch looked worn out, scratched silver edges, cracked crystal, faded brown leather strap. Nothing about it suggested status or money. I told him it still kept time. Harold smirked and said a grown man should eventually buy himself a real watch. Across the table, my wife Emily immediately looked down at her plate because she hated moments like that. I simply shrugged and told him it had belonged to my father. Normally mentioning the dead creates at least temporary decency in people, but not Harold. He smiled toward the table and joked that sentimental value was free. A few guests laughed politely because people trapped at formal dinners usually laughed to avoid discomfort. I remember looking down at the watch after that, not angry, just tired. The second hand still hesitated slightly before each minute marker, a tiny flaw I had noticed since childhood. My father used to wind that watch every night while sitting at the kitchen table, drinking black coffee before work. I had not thought about that memory in years. A couple hours later, the banquet had mostly ended. Staff members folded chairs near the ballroom walls while conversations broke into smaller groups. Veterans Day events always seemed to end the same way. Loud speeches at the beginning and quiet reflection at the end. I was standing near the hallway outside the coat room loosening my tie, while waiting for Emily to finish speaking with someone from church when an older voice behind me quietly said, "Excuse me." I turned and recognized the retired 4-star General Harold had spent most of the evening orbiting around. General Thomas Whitmore stood there in a dark charcoal suit with the kind of posture that never fully leaves career military men. But he was not looking at my face. He was staring directly at my watch. He asked if he could see it. Something in his tone made me remove it immediately. The moment he held it in his hand, his expression changed completely. Not nostalgia, recognition. He turned the watch over slowly and rubbed his thumb across the engraving on the back. "For courage under fire," then initials beneath it. The general swallowed hard before asking where I got it. I told him it belonged to my father. Then he asked my father's name. When I answered Michael Carter, the color drained from his face instantly. Not dramatically, genuinely, like memory had physically struck him before his thoughts caught up. For a second I thought he might lose his balance. Instead, he straightened slowly and asked if my father had been Captain Michael Carter. I told him yes. By then nearby conversations had faded as people sensed something serious unfolding. Harold noticed too and moved toward us automatically, drawn toward importance the way some people are drawn toward smoke. The general stared down at the watch again and quietly admitted he had not seen it since 1991. Nobody spoke. Then he looked directly at me and asked if I knew what my father had done during Desert Storm. I admitted I really did not. That answer seemed to affect him more than anything else. He exhaled slowly and explained that my father had saved 31 soldiers during a failed extraction operation in Kuwait after a communications collapse, left their convoy trapped under enemy fire. According to him, my father stayed behind alone to restore the relay manually while everyone else evacuated. My heart started pounding because none of this sounded like the man I knew growing up. My father worked maintenance at a paper mill for 30 years. He fixed lawnmowers for neighbors who could not afford repairs. He paid bills exactly on time and woke before sunrise every morning. That was the version of him I understood. The general continued by explaining that after the operation, my father had been recommended for an immediate promotion, but refused it because he believed another officer deserved it more. The general actually smiled, remembering the argument they had about it. Then he handed the watch back to me carefully and said my father wore it every day because it reminded him that people understand time differently after watching others run out of it. Suddenly, I could hear my father winding the watch again at the kitchen table late at night. Same chair, same silence, same quiet ticking. The general finally noticed Harold standing beside us and asked if he was family. Harold awkwardly explained he was my father-in-law. The general looked between us once and seemed to understand the entire evening immediately. Then he quietly said that Harold probably had no idea who I really was. Nobody moved after that. Harold's face changed slowly from confusion to embarrassment to something deeper. The look people get when authority quietly leaves them in public. For the rest of the evening, everyone treated me differently, and honestly that part bothered me most. The same stories, same life, same job suddenly seemed more meaningful because an important man had publicly attached significance to them. Outside near the parking lot, cold rain had started falling while staff carried folded tables back inside. Harold found me standing alone near the railing overlooking the golf course. For a while neither of us spoke. Then he shoved his hands into his coat pockets and muttered that I could have mentioned all of that earlier. I asked him what exactly I was supposed to mention. He said my father, the military history, the fact that a 4-star general talked about him like he was a legend. I leaned against the railing and quietly told him my father never talked about any of it himself. Harold frowned and asked why not. I thought about that for a long moment before answering honestly. That my father never did those things so people would admire him. Rain tapped softly against the parked cars around us while Harold stared at the pavement. Finally, he nodded once. It was not quite an apology, but maybe the closest version he knew how to give. Later that night, after Emily had fallen asleep, I sat alone in the living room holding the watch in my hand. The cracked crystal reflected the dim hallway light. 4 years I believed wearing it kept me connected to my father. But sitting there in the quiet, I realized something else entirely. He never wore it to prove his worth to anyone either.